You are listening to Therapist Unplugged for straight talk on life, relationships, and mental health. I am your host, Lori Poole, licensed professional counselor with the Montfort Group in North Dallas. Each episode will feature the unplugged views of guests and fellow therapists as we navigate hot topics, therapy trends, and the world around us. All right, here we are. Welcome everyone to Therapist Unplugged. And my guest today is Courtney Strull, licensed professional
Hello.
counselor at the Montfort Group. Hi, Court.
Hello. Love meeting with
Hello.
you.
This is going to be so fun because we're going to talk about my favorite subject and yours too, which is attachment style. And as we were chatting just before we started today's podcast, there's been a lot more reference and material in social media about attachment styles. When I think back on the work that I've been doing in adult attachment styles when I work with couples, and now it's everywhere. There are so many folks that are talking about it. And I know, Courtney, that this is an important element of the work you do with your clients. And so I'm wondering if maybe we could start off today, if you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of niche or
Yeah.
clients with whom you work and how this has come into the work that you do with your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So attachment work really started, it's so fascinating to me because knowing what I know now, it's kind of shocking to me that, in grad school, we spent probably 10 to 20 minutes on attachment. And having learned what I learned now, I'm sitting here like, this is the premise of everything I do with every client who walks in my door, whether it's depression, anxiety, an eating disorder, OCD tendencies, trauma. I think there's so much connection with attachment that before, and I didn't know what I didn't know until I learned it, and we'll get into how
Hmm.
I learned it and what catapulted me into
Okay.
this journey of attachment. Um, but yeah, I'd say to me, it's really such an honor to see the progress with clients from when they walk in and to see them living a life of inner peace. And it takes a long time. Like, this isn't we come to therapy once or twice and we fixed it. The way I like to talk about attachment is, we're going backwards. We're delving into what was happening in our most primitive years of development, 0 to 7 years old. And so many people say to me, Court, I don't know. I don't remember what happened then. And of course, I don't expect them to. But if we can help identify, even in their adolescent years, what was going on with your parents? What was their relationship like? What was it like when you came home from elementary school or middle school? What do you remember? And
Hmm.
helping them connecting those dots. And what I have found is when we help people explore what happened then, we can really understand how and why we function the way we do now in our significant relationships, especially, but also at work with friends, how we view the world. Uh, and truly, like when I earned a more secure attachment, it felt like I was wearing a rainbow pair of glasses for the first time in my life.
Well, you know what I'm thinking, Courtney, for those of our listeners who don't know anything about attachment style or haven't been exposed to the information, could you maybe outline sort of the three very basic attachment styles? Like, what does attachment mean?
So, it's interesting because the ones that I think are talked about most often are anxious avoidant and anxious ambivalent. So the anxious is probably someone who's consumed by their partner's behavior or overanalyzing everything that their friends do if they get canceled on, or the avoidant is probably someone who doesn't check in with you when things are going awry because they don't want to be checked in when things are going awry. They don't know how to identify what's going on for them. So they certainly
Hmm.
don't know how to address what's going on for you. And this doesn't make them bad. These are all, forms of self preservation. And the anxious ambivalence, a little bit of both, being consumed by other people's behavior, but also retreating at the other end of the spectrum at times. Um,
Sure.
but the quiz I like to administer to clients is the How We Love quiz, and it actually delves into 5 different styles of attachment. There's anxious, avoidant, controller, vacillator, and the victim.
So when we think about attachment, I want to go back even a little bit more and maybe throw in some physiological, biochemical, brain functioning fundamentals to attachment, which is that as human beings, we are really wired for connection.
Of course.
And so that this element of attachment based in childhood is what we look for from our caretakers to know that we are safe, secure, that when we are distressed, there will be a response of comfort and reassurance. And if we don't get that as children, if we are in an environment where there's unpredictability, where there is depression, addiction, chaos and trauma, other things going on in the household, and we don't receive or have the experience of what we're naturally wired for, then we find ways of surviving in that environment.
And then we
So,
seek it out
yes,
subconsciously.
we drift towards what's familiar,
Hmm.
right? So, if as a child, I am in an environment where my mom is like a moving target because of her own distress or what's going on. And sometimes she can respond to me and sometimes she doesn't.
Hmm.
I may learn that in order to get what I need from her, to take care of her emotionally. And then my focus becomes on all the externals, because the only way I can be okay is if the adults are okay, and they can be okay if I'm taking care of them, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to kind of map that out to give listeners an idea of how
Of course.
deeply some of these patterns evolve over time in response to our environment, in part because of how we're naturally wired when we come into the world, right?
Hmm.
Because we do
Yeah.
come into the world, our birth order. Maybe an eldest child is much more attuned to what's going on than second born who doesn't really give a shit. It could be like, or maybe vice versa, because there's
Uh-huh.
no predictor necessarily, but it's all of these variables and much more that can then contribute to the attachment style that evolves
Hmm.
and that creates the lens through which we view relationships, ourselves, and the world.
Yeah, and I think I'll go backwards for a second to talk about again what catapulted me into this realm. And
Mhm.
I had been to several therapists before and they were all lovely. And I found that they were super helpful during times of crisis, but I was always landing myself in these same patterns in relationships
Mhm.
specifically. And I always had long-term relationships, but I always end up feeling the same way in every single relationship. And then when it ended, being so distraught. And then upon reflection and knowing what I know now, I was a common denominator, not to blame myself. And that's a big piece of the attachment counseling that I love. It's like when we
Mhm.
understand what was happening with our parents, what we've witnessed, like almost computer engineering your brain.
That's right. No, your brain becomes programmed in
Thank you.
response to
Yes.
the environment. Okay, this is what I need to do to survive, to secure love, to regulate my own inner emotional experience in this environment, because we all want to be loved. We all want to feel loved.
We're wired for it and we need
We're
it. And
wired for it.
when we
Absolutely.
don't get that from our caregivers, and again, I think part of the healing too that's so hard for people to go through is the being angry or grieving what they couldn't get from their parents because they weren't capable emotionally. Um, and that is part of the healing process. Like you might be angry, you might be sad, and then at the end of it, we learn and come to understand how come they were the way they were based on what happened to them in their childhood.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's true healing is being able to maintain a relationship, understand they weren't capable of meeting my needs. And now as an adult, I get to do that for myself in the ways that they couldn't. But we can't negate or skip the part where we get to be sad for little me who didn't get those needs met. And I think that I avoided this for so long. It's like I could understand that these patterns existed in my relationships. And then something terrible in my life happened when my dad got sick. And,
Right.
I go from eating dinner with my parents every other week or once a week and talking to them via text once a day to being around them 7 days a week. And
Mm.
there's nothing more triggering than that. So suddenly I'm living on the surface like, oh, I've got a good relationship with my parents, when I
Yeah.
keep them at an
Yeah.
arm's length and now I'm with you every day and oh my goodness, everything is coming back.
Yeah.
And so I like to say the attachment therapy, I mentioned my other forms of therapy prior to this. I didn't really go into detail about, the theories or what we were working on necessarily, but I
Mhm.
found all of those therapies to be a band-aid and attachment is I believe what offered me surgery to be able to truly live life differently. Like I've never felt
Wow.
like inner peace, consistency. I don't have these high, low lows anymore.
Hmm.
My life is kind of boring and I like it.
So you found your inner life. It sounds as though your inner life isn't an emotional EKG that it might have been before
Before.
you embarked in this whole process of inner healing and understanding that the ways you showed up were in response to environment or a number of factors, but that you actually could respond to things differently.
Totally. And to add to it, I had moved in with my significant other. We were 4 months into living together. My dad gets sick. So not only am I triggered by being around my parents 7 days a week, but now I'm living with the partner that I chose prior to being securely attached. So, and we'll get into that because I have some examples that I really think are profound in terms of understanding attachment.
Yeah,
And I love using personal examples without great detail because I it's so much easier when it's someone else's story
sure, sure.
than when we're talking about our own.
I will share a personal story that has been a recent aha for me. And it is very much about attachment court. My mom was a very, very reactive woman. So if I said I didn't feel well, if I wasn't happy and upbeat, then I was queer, I was interrogated and so on. And so expressing what I needed or wanted wasn't safe. That's what I told myself. It's not safe. I'll get in trouble. So as a result, I drifted towards men who were not emotionally available. So they initially felt really safe, but in
Hmm.
the end, they weren't responding to me either. So because they weren't reacting the way my mom did. Right. And so that sort of avoidant, pursuing, anxious stuff is also what I watched between my parents.
Of
So you
course.
just end up in this, there's all these influences of what you witness in terms of how the adults treat each other in the household that you live in.
Hmm.
And also you may go towards a completely different scenario thinking that you'll be safer there when in fact your needs still are not being met.
Yeah, it's phenomenal how all of this plays out and how it's all
It
connected.
is.
An
It's
example, like
fascinating.
a very minor example, when I come home from high school and let's say I was in a bad mood, because human beings sometimes have bad days or just wake up not feeling so good. And maybe we
Yeah.
do have an attitude, and especially with the people we feel the safest with. But I can remember coming home from high school and, how are you? Fine. What's wrong? Nothing. And that becoming something personal, more specifically, probably to my mom than anyone. And then the volatility that was created from that. Like, why do you have an attitude? I do everything for you. And then 30 years later, I find myself in my relationship when he gets home from work and he's quiet. And I'm like, what's wrong? Nothing. What's wrong? Nothing. And I'm like, oh shit.
Oh, here comes the
How
script
come
being
it feels this
replayed.
way? How come it feels this way? And it felt so true to me because that's all I knew. That is my hardwiring. And that's the word, you said programming. That is how I was hardwired. When I am taught this is a threat, of course, now my nervous system believes this is a threat. And I think most people want to do better than what was done for them. And I made a vow to myself, like, I will do better for my children than what was done for me. But then, like I said, my dad gets sick. I move in with Drew, and I see how I turn out like my mom in 30 years or my parents' relationship if I didn't get access to this type of counseling. Because
Right.
again, I understand how it made her body feel now because I was starting to see it with myself. And you add in children and full time work and financial stress, I see
Sure.
how it happens. And so, in some ways, the worst thing that ever happened to me in terms of my dad getting sick um, is what led me or forced me to go find this peace because I didn't think I was going to survive it. And so, again, worst thing that happened to me turned out led me to do the healing that I always deserved.
Yes, that you always deserved. And that by doing so, there was you kind of broke the paradigm of intergenerational trauma, attachment style, communication styles, expression of love,
Hmm.
all
And
of that.
I have a classic example in my relationship that perfectly, I think, a lot of, not just in heterosexual relationships, but I think a theme, specifically with heterosexual relationships. And it's an example I like to use with my clients. But when I first started doing this healing, one of my first awarenesses in my own relationship was Drew and I would get into an argument, and he's the avoidant. He has some pleasing, but definitely leads with avoidance. And I'm the opposite. I'm the overfunctioner. I'm the pleaser. I'm the vacillator. I'm consumed by other people's energy, his behavior. Um, and so we get into a fight. And for 2 years, it was like after we'd fight, he'd go retreat, similar to what my mom did. So, this is very triggering to me, of
Hmm.
course.
Hmm.
And after we'd fight, it'd be like, this is, impacting my abandonment issues. This is how it made me feel when my mom would, slam the door when she was upset and I couldn't
Hmm.
communicate with her. And what would go on for me, or the story I would tell myself when Drew would walk away in these fights, is if he cared about me, he wouldn't be doing this. We've had this conversation 100 times. After every fight, we have this discussion, and he promises he won't do it again. And what I came to understand is I'm begging him to show up for me and meet my needs in the ways that my parents couldn't, but I'm asking him to abandon himself, like his self preservation techniques from his own childhood, in order to
Hmm.
mitigate my own anxiety. And when I learned that I can mitigate my own anxiety, that I can deal with my distress in that moment, it's so interesting how our dynamic shifted. So, like, I'm begging him to show up for me in the ways that I need while I'm forgetting that he's a human with trauma and a childhood. And
Right.
I'm not saying it's right that he walks away, but that's what he learned when he was a kid and what works for him because he doesn't know how another way.
That's right. And the other piece of this is that both positions in that feedback loop that the two of you have are ways of protecting the relationship. They
Mm-hmm.
are protective moves. So if I move away from you, then I'm not going to make the situation worse. And it's a way I deal with my anxiety at the threat of losing the connection. And for you, it's let's talk about this. Let's work it out. I need to come towards me because when you walk away like that, it's scary. And then I'm left in this sort of place of void waiting for you to come back to me. And I don't know when that's going to be. And
Mm-hmm.
so just let me know we're okay. Because if I think we're not okay, then my anxiety goes up. And then I start to fill in the blanks and create this narrative.
Yes, but and the story when he'd walk away, I think was the most
Hmm.
detrimental thing for me and in the relate not I can't speak to the whole relationship, but on my end of the relationship, because
Yeah,
again, the story was if you cared, you wouldn't be walking away.
that's
And
right.
so my frustrations rising, I'm waiting for him to come towards me. And then I hit a point of like, I can't handle the conflict anymore. So I'm coming towards him and abandoning myself because my belief is like, well, you should be coming towards me because now I feel wronged. Right.
Yeah. No, for
And
sure.
interestingly, when I learned how to mitigate my anxiety, when I learned, okay, when he steps away, I'm going to work on my narrative. And this isn't easy. I mean, this took months. I think I've been at the attachment thing for 2.5 years now. And I do feel as though I've mastered it pretty well, but that doesn't mean I don't have triggering moments where sometimes I'm like, I know everything, I have all the tools, and yet I'm having a very hard time accessing the ability to
Sure.
utilize
Well,
said
that's,
tools.
listen, you're human.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah,
just funny, like the level of conscious awareness and logic, and sometimes it's still so hard. Um,
sure.
but I'd say 95% of the time I've mastered this thing. So if he walks away in the middle of an argument, the story I tell myself now is like, okay, like I think of 7-year-old Drew, the kid who had to retreat as his own form of self-preservation. And when I see it that way, when I'm talking to myself in that way, and it's not personal to me, like he's not, is
Hmm.
Drew thinking before he walks away, I'm going to do this to make Courtney feel abandoned? No, he's fighting because that's
Hmm.
that's what he knows. And when I came to understand that, what's interesting is he did come towards me when I wasn't begging for it, when I wasn't telling him why it was wrong that he was leaving. He did come towards me,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it changed everything.
That's so interesting. So tell me, how do you, with your personal experience, with your therapy experience, how do you work with clients on this? Because, like you said, it's not an add water and stir process.
So one of the first things I like to do when clients come to me is one, I like to do some activities just to get to know them, background information about what's bringing them through the doors. And after probably the third session, I like to administer the How We Love quiz and start
Hmm.
talking to them about what they score high in to start connecting those dots. And then we really start delving into family of origin. So not only does the quiz address like maybe what was happening in childhood, but probably how you function in a relationship. And the accuracy is astounding. It's almost scary. I mean, I can remember when I got my results and I'm reading it and I'm like, I feel so heard and validated, and yet I feel so sad.
What was the sadness?
They were calling out every my childhood. For the first time, it wasn't okay. One of my favorite quotes by David Schnarch in Passionate Marriages, we think we know who we are before we are in relationship, and the truth is we find out who we are and we don't like what we see. And instead of being curious about how come their behavior makes us feel that way, we tend to point our fingers and say that they're the problem. And that is everything
That's
I ever
right.
knew and did, and that is what I witness in most every relationship.
Yeah.
And that quote like almost sealed the deal for me, put the nail in the coffin. I'm like a year into my attachment counseling. I read that and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I do better when I'm single because I don't like who I am in the relationship. Like I don't like my own behavior, but I tend to blame him. Like
That's right.
you walked away and now I feel out of control. I don't like how I
Yeah.
feel and it's your fault.
Court, everything that you're describing reminds me of how important it is to evolve the relationship with ourselves. And that's really what you're talking about. That this attachment work that you've been doing is really about recalibrating the relationship with yourself as an adult and
Yes.
going within and healing from things that you experienced as a child, but really discovering who you are, in addition to acknowledging and appreciating what you went through and how your little brain, I say little because you're a kid, right? You don't have an
Mm-hmm.
adult brain till you're 25, but that child in you did her very, very best to make sense of. And of course, we all create narratives because that's the way we make sense of. And we really aren't brought up with a focus on going within. We look at what's going on around us, particularly uh, those of us with anxious sort of propensities. I'm raising my hand
Mm-hmm.
on that one. And so, yeah, it's really about that relationship with ourselves. Gabor Mate says something really interesting for anybody listening who's interested in his book, The Myth of Normal. He says, we marry people who trigger us. And we get into that relationship and we partner with people who trigger us. There's this initial attraction, but ultimately there's also these triggering experiences because they bring out in us those parts of us that we don't like
Mm-hmm.
when we find ourselves in playing out those same scenarios like you talked about. How was your day? Oh, fine. What do you mean it was fine?
Yeah,
Right?
or I think, I even go back to as my brother's having kids, Drew's siblings having children. I think about when we're with them, the toddlers, and when they're throwing a fit, or if I'm at Target and I see a kid throwing a tantrum on the floor, how I hope as a parent that I deal with this. And I actually think I talked about this on the first podcast we did together, is being able to look at my kid and say, you're really mad right now. I'm going to be right over here. And whenever you're ready, I'll be here. I love you.
Hmm.
And I'm going to walk a few feet away while they're throwing their tantrum on aisle three.
Hmm.
I'm still going to be able to see them. I will not be far away, but it won't be personal to me. So often I'm walking through the grocery
Hmm.
store and I see kids screaming or yelling, and the parents' responses. There's a little alarm bells going off in my head, and I understand most every parent's doing the best they can with what they've got. But a kid's tantrum isn't supposed to be personal. They're communicating in the only ways that they know how.
Hmm.
And they simply don't have the verbiage or the ability to communicate. And I think too, like starting at age 2 and 3. So like when we're talking about these tantrums in grocery stores, if you have the parent who says like, I know you're frustrated, you really want that Barbie doll, and you're not allowed to have that Barbie doll today, and you're allowed to be mad at me and I'll be right over here. I love you so much. I'll be here when you're ready. Versus the parent who's stop being a spoiled brat or get in the cart right now, or it becomes personal. I think about these experiences in the early stages of development and how this impacts you and
Hmm.
your adulthood. Because how can it not?
It does. And I think there's such a thing as cellular memory, so that even though you don't maybe recall a specific event, it all contributes over time.
I think of another example. So, knowing what I know now, again, I understand this came from my mom's own insecurities, but even in kindergarten, from as early as I can remember, I was not allowed to ask if people could come over, if I could go to people's houses in front of them. So not in front of the parents, not in front of the kid. This was like an unspoken secret, right?
Hmm.
Like I might get a pinch on the shoulder or a not very nice look starting at a very young age. And when I reflect on that now, and I actually that example I feel like led to a lot of my pleasing, a lot of my speak when spoken to mentality because I understood and I knew I'd be in trouble and I didn't want to be in trouble. And when I reflect now, my mom was so insecure that she didn't want to say no because she didn't want to be the bad guy. But
Hmm.
it's okay for our kids to be mad at us sometimes. And when we're solid at the core, when we have an understanding of who we are, it doesn't matter if the other parent is judging us for not letting our kid come spend the night because of whatever we have going on. And I think most people
Yeah.
probably aren't judging, but I'm just speaking to now I can understand how and why she was the way she was. But man, I was
Hmm.
mad for a long time.
It's very true. And I think that doing the family of origin work can shed an awful lot of light in terms of patterns that get repeated and give us some insight and understanding. Then the deeper work becomes on how do we change some of that hard wiring? How do we adjust it so that we can show up as our most authentic self in a way that just feels so much lighter and gives us that inner peace and freedom? Can you sort of get into a little bit more about how you work with clients once they've done this, once they've done the questionnaire and you look at the results and so on? What are some of the things? I mean, I know, listen, we have 7 minutes left, so I know there's not a lot of time, but just a high level overview, Court, of how you use attachment as a theme or tool in your work with clients, regardless of what the presenting issue is.
Yeah. So, moving through the quiz, I obviously have some book resources that I like some clients to read depending on their circumstances because it's not one size fits all. Even
Hmm.
if we both score high and vacillating, it still can present differently, even if there are some similar patterns. So I do like to do family genograms to understand generational patterns.
Hmm.
I know you're very into that as well.
Yep. Hmm.
But one of the things I say is even just the act of helping people understand. So before I get into what's going on in their current life, helping them understand what happened then, because when we understand how and why we function the way we do, I think we move from a place of judgment and shame to understanding how and why we are the way we are. And
Yeah.
with that comes profound change. So instead of like, after that fight that Drew and I have, and then I have so much shame for how I have felt. Maybe not in that moment, but a couple days later, I'm internalizing it. I don't like how I behaved.
Mm.
After I'm mad at him, then it's what's wrong with me? How come I always do this? Why do I feel this way? And again, when I help people understand what happened then and why it's this way now, just even that level of understanding offers so much peace. The hard part is the being triggered, having the conscious awareness, and not having the ability to do anything quite yet. It's like such a
Yeah.
process. And I
Sitting
can
in that.
remember, I can remember
Uh,
too at the beginning of the healing, it was like, I've never felt this way. I'm wearing rainbow colored glasses. Like nothing was personal to me anymore. And I felt so free. Literally, I can't describe it in any other way, but my body felt at peace literally for the first time ever. And then I hit a pothole. And I can remember being so overwhelmed because it's like I've I've accessed this peace feeling and I don't feel peaceful at all and it's lasting like a week and I'm almost internally freaking out because it's like I went and did this rewiring. I'm malfunctioning back to my, you know, the the original hardware and it's not working and it's really overwhelming. And I think too, just being a human who's been through this experience and when I watch clients through this journey, it's almost helpful to be able to say, it sounds like you hit a pothole and I want you to know you're gonna get through it. And
yeah.
here's how, like being able to give them some predictability. Like this isn't going to be linear. You're going to have weeks where you're feeling really good, and then you're going to have a triggering event and you're going to feel
That's right.
activated, and it's going to be so difficult to pull yourself out of that pothole. I almost like giving them that preparation.
It's like expectation management.
Yes. So I'd say the quiz, genogram work,
Yeah.
moving from the place of shame and judgment to understanding why we are the way we are. What are some of the other things I like to do? Like the present moment criteria and examples in interpersonal relationships, whether it's
Hmm.
a significant relationship or I've got a lot of ideas about how come people choose certain professions based on their attachment: nurses, teachers, police officers, firefighters,
Therapists,
therapists,
therapists.
myself. Yes, I got a master's in this thing because I wanted to understand, right? Um,
Yes,
yeah, it's connected to everything.
absolutely. Absolutely connected to everything. And I think that clients are so lucky to have you, Courtney, to really dive into this work because it is deep, deep work. It is, it's not going to be all done in 10 sessions. It requires commitment and curiosity. And I think the piece about self-judgment is so important because there's an awful lot of self-judgment
Mhm.
that we all experience and things we tell ourselves about our responses and ways we really like we just don't like that
Mhm.
part of ourselves that we don't like when we get triggered and into these places where we're so uncomfortable.
Totally. And the other thing, you asked what my approach is with clients. Once we've come to understand a little bit about what's going on in childhood, who we've selected or the job profession that we've selected and whatever's going on in these worlds and connecting those dots, when triggered, I ask them to write down 4 questions. And this isn't easy. I can remember exactly where I was standing the first time I tried to do this, but
Okay.
when Drew snapped at me and I have a negative thought. So the second I realize I have a negative thought, it's what's going on for me right now.
Yeah.
Where do I feel this in my body? Because I want to start
Yeah.
creating mind body connection. Because if I can
Yeah.
identify, okay, I feel this in my chest, I don't know what's going on for me, I might be able to access these things more quickly. Did Drew just say this to make me feel blank? What insert whatever negative feeling here. 99.9999999% of the time the answer is no. And so then my next question is, okay, so what's going on for me right now? If we know that this
Hmm.
wasn't intentional, as much as it might feel that way, even if we've had the conversation 100 times, I can go leaving the dishes in the sink. This was something I had to, like, again, rewire my brain. It's like I've told you 20 times, this really bothers me. More than 20, 200. And now when I see a dish in the sink and I'm like, ugh, mofo left the bowl in the sink, it's more like, huh, okay, did Drew sit here thinking I'm going to leave this bowl in the sink to make her curse me out in my head? Or was he probably running late for a meeting and had to throw the bowl in the sink and log on? And what I've come to understand is more often than not, it's option number two.
Yeah. It's not part of a plot.
And it's so empowering when we understand that and when other people can't consume us the way they once did.
That's right. Courtney, listen, we could talk so much more about attachment and we may have to do a part two. But thank
I'm
you
all
very,
for it.
very much for
Of
all our time
course.
because I think part two is about mind body connection. Where do you feel this in your body? Because our body speaks to us when we get triggered and when these attachment issues come up. Thank you so much for your time today.
The Montfort Group aims to provide a serene, calming setting where you can feel challenged, supported, and motivated. Our skilled therapists bridge specialized backgrounds and varied philosophies together to create one unified strategy. Rather than steer you away from your own natural abilities, we help you maximize your unique strengths to uncover the boldest version of yourself. We do not view a broken history as the end of a story. We see it as an opportunity for a new beginning. To learn more about our practice and how we can help you, please visit us at themontfortgroup.com.